The villagers bound Eleanor's wrists with rope as they tore her infant daughter from her arms, determined to leave the marked child on the smoking volcano as sacrifice. Her desperate prayers seemed answered when, through tear-blurred vision, she glimpsed the silhouette of an Apache warrior moving silently toward her abandoned baby. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Beneath the merciless Arizona sun, as the summer of 1892 consumed the land with insatiable thirst, the small settlement of Hollow Creek withered day by day. The stream that had given the town its name had shrunk to barely a trickle, its banks cracked and broken like the spirits of those who had built their homes along its edges. In the shadow of the smoking mountain, locals called Old Widow's Peak, hope diminished with every rainless sunrise. Eleanor Wilson clutched her swollen belly and gazed at the parched fields from the doorway of her modest cabin. Her husband Thomas had ridden out 3 days prior to search for work in the larger settlements to the east. Their food stores were dwindling, and the small garden she had tended with such care had yielded nothing but brittle stems and yellowed leaves. "This babe picks a cruel time to enter our world," she whispered, feeling the child within her shift restlessly. At 19, with hollowed cheeks and hands calloused beyond her years, Eleanor already knew more of suffering than most twice her age. The settlement's 15 families had once dreamed of prosperity in this valley. They had come with visions of fertile fields and abundant harvests, but for 2 years now, the skies had withheld their blessing. Some whispered that the mountain, with its occasional plumes of dark smoke and ominous rumbling, had cursed the land. Others blamed the Apache tribes that still moved through the distant hills like shadows. That evening, as the relentless heat finally began to subside, Eleanor's labor pains began. Martha Cunningham, the settlement's midwife, arrived with her weathered leather bag and grim expression. "God help us bring this child into something better than what awaits outside," Martha muttered, helping Eleanor to the bed. Through the night, Eleanor's cries mingled with the distant howling of coyotes. The women of Hollow Creek gathered in the small front room, their faces gaunt with hunger and worry. They boiled what clean water remained and tore precious linens into strips. When dawn broke, a baby girl's wail cut through the heavy silence, but the momentary joy crumbled when Martha lifted the infant into the dim light. "Lord, have mercy," she breathed. The child was small but formed well enough, yet across her chest and right shoulder spread an angry red birthmark, branching like lightning or the veins of molten rock that occasionally glowed upon the mountainside on the darkest nights. Eleanor reached for her daughter with trembling hands. "She's beautiful," she whispered, but her voice carried an uncertain tremor. "The mark of fire," said Agnes Webb, the oldest of the gathered women. Her eyes narrowed as she made the sign of the cross. "Born in drought, marked by flame. This is an omen." "Nonsense," Martha snapped, though her hands shook as she wrapped the infant. "She's just a babe." But in the days that followed, as the drought deepened and the first livestock began to die, whispers spread through Hollow Creek. The child with the mark had brought more misfortune upon them. When Thomas Wilson failed to return and 3 children fell ill with fever, those whispers grew louder. Eleanor named her daughter Rose for the color that bloomed across her tiny chest. She held her close at night, singing softly as tears tracked silently down her cheeks. She heard the murmurs when she ventured out, saw how the women pulled their own children away, how men refused to meet her gaze. Then the Cunninghams' well dried up completely. That same night, lightning struck the settlement's small church, and flames consumed what had been their last communal refuge. The next morning, Agnes Webb stood at Eleanor's door. The women of Hollow Creek gathered behind her like crows. "The child must go," Agnes said, her voice flat as the dusty earth beneath their feet. "The mountain demands it." Eleanor clutched Rose to her chest, her eyes wild. "She's my daughter. She's our doom," Agnes replied, and the hollow-eyed crowd moved forward as one. The women of Hollow Creek moved like specters through the cabin, their determination hardened by fear and desperation. Eleanor fought with the fierce strength of a mother bear, clawing and screaming as they tore Rose from her arms. Martha Cunningham stood in the corner, her face buried in her hands, complicit in her silence. "Please!" Eleanor's voice cracked like the parched earth. "She's just an innocent child." Agnes Webb's weathered face remained impassive. "Innocence has nothing to do with curses, girl. The mountain must be appeased." Two men entered, Samuel Yates and Frederick Palmer, their hats held respectfully in calloused hands, eyes downcast with shame yet resolve. They bound Eleanor's wrists to the bedpost with strips of cloth as she thrashed and begged. "You'll thank us when the rains come," Samuel muttered, though he couldn't meet her gaze. In the growing darkness, the solemn procession wound its way up the rocky path that led toward Old Widow's Peak. Agnes carried the infant who had fallen into an exhausted sleep after crying herself hoarse. The settlement's remaining residents followed, torches flickering, prayers murmured with desperate hope. Miles away on the far side of the mountain, Takoda stood at the entrance of his solitary camp, nestled within a sheltered canyon. At 45, his face was etched with deep lines that spoke of both wisdom and sorrow. His dark eyes scanned the horizon as the day's final light painted the distant cliffs in shades of amber and blood. 15 summers had passed since soldiers had descended upon his village while he was away hunting. 15 years since he'd returned to find his wife, son, and infant daughter slaughtered alongside the rest of his people. The Apache bands that still moved through these territories respected his desire for solitude, understanding that some wounds never truly heal. Takoda lifted his head, nostrils flaring slightly. Something rode the evening breeze. Smoke, yes, but also something less tangible. A wrongness. He'd lived long enough to trust these instincts. He gathered his rifle, knife, and water skin, securing them methodically before starting up the winding deer trail that would take him higher into the mountain's embrace. Back in the cabin, Eleanor strained against her bindings until her wrists bled. With a final desperate effort, she managed to free one hand, then the other. She stumbled from the bed, her body still weak from childbirth, and lurched toward the door. The settlement lay eerily quiet, abandoned as all had joined the grim procession. Eleanor followed their distant torchlight, her bare feet bleeding on the sharp rocks, her nightdress fluttering in the hot wind that always seemed to flow from the mountain's summit. She climbed with manic determination, falling repeatedly only to rise again, her mother's heart pulling her forward when her body wanted to surrender. On the mountain slopes, Agnes raised her hand, and the procession halted. They had reached a natural shelf of rock where the ground cracked with heat from below. Small vents released wisps of steam, and the scent of sulfur tainted the air. It was as close as they dared approach the smoldering caldera. "We return to the mountain what belongs to it," Agnes intoned, unwrapping Rose to expose the birthmark that so terrified them. The infant woke, crying weakly, her tiny fists balling against the night air. Martha stepped forward suddenly. "This isn't right, Agnes. She's just a babe." Agnes's face hardened. "And what of our children? Will you watch them waste away while we nurse this curse among us?" She turned to the gathered settlers. "Who else will speak against what must be done?" Eyes lowered. No one spoke. Agnes placed Rose on a flat stone, the angry birthmark vivid against her pale skin in the torchlight. "May this sacrifice end our suffering," she declared, then turned her back and began the descent. One by one, the others followed, some crossing themselves, others wiping tears from sunken cheeks. None looked back at the wailing infant they had abandoned to the mountain's mercy. Takoda heard the child's cries carried on the night wind. He quickened his pace, moving with the silent efficiency that had once made him one of his tribe's most respected hunters. He followed the sound, pausing occasionally to ensure he hadn't lost the trail. The infant's wails grew weaker, more intermittent, stoking an urgency in his chest. When he finally spotted the small, pale form on the dark stone, something long dormant awakened within him. He approached cautiously, rifle ready, scanning for whoever might have left a child in such a forsaken place. The ground beneath his moccasins felt unnaturally warm, and the rock shelf was veined with glowing cracks that hadn't been visible from a distance. The mountain was restless tonight, as if disturbed by the human drama unfolding upon its slopes. Eleanor crested a ridge and spotted a dark figure bending over her child. "No!" she screamed, summoning her last reserves of strength to scramble forward. The mountain shuddered beneath them, a low rumble reverberating through stone and soil. Dakota's head snapped up at Eleanor's cry, his hand instinctively moving to his knife. Their eyes met across the rocky expanse, his dark and wary, hers wild with fear and desperation. "Get away from her!" Eleanor stumbled forward, her nightdress torn and stained with blood from her injured feet, her hair a tangled mess around her pale face. Dakota remained motionless, assessing the white woman who appeared more ghost than human in the pale moonlight. He recognized the look in her eyes, the primal, desperate fury of a mother separated from her child. He slowly raised his empty hands, palms forward. "The child," he said in careful, accented English, "she is yours." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded frantically, closing the distance between them with painful steps. "They took her. They said she's cursed." Her voice broke as she reached for Rose, who had fallen silent, her tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Dakota stepped back, allowing Eleanor to gather her daughter into her arms. The infant's skin felt cool, too cool. As Eleanor clutched Rose to her breast, weeping with relief, Dakota surveyed their surroundings with growing concern. The fissures in the rock glowed brighter now, and the air carried the acrid smell of sulfur and heat. "This place is not safe," he said firmly. "The mountain wakes." As if confirming his words, the ground trembled again, more violently this time. A crack split the rock where the baby had lain moments before, and steam hissed upward like the breath of some massive beast stirring below. Eleanor swayed on her feet, exhaustion and blood loss finally overtaking her maternal adrenaline. I don't think I can make it down," she admitted, her voice small and frightened. Dakota's expression remained impassive, but his mind worked quickly. He had avoided white settlements for years, had sworn never to trust those whose kind had destroyed everything he loved. Yet before him stood a woman, cast out by her own people, clutching a child they had condemned. And beneath them, the mountain was speaking in a language he understood all too well. "I will help you," he said finally, reaching for the infant. "The child will be safer with me while we descend." Eleanor instinctively pulled back, protecting Rose with her body. "You will fall," Dakota stated simply, pointing to her bleeding feet. "And she will die with you." The brutal truth of his words sank in. With visible reluctance, Eleanor surrendered her daughter. Dakota carefully secured the infant inside his buckskin shirt, close to his body heat. The birthmark was visible briefly, angry red against pale skin, and something flickered in his dark eyes before he turned away. "Follow, step where I step." He began picking his way down the treacherous slope, one hand supporting the baby, the other occasionally reaching back to steady Eleanor. They had descended perhaps 100 yards when a deafening crack split the night. Above them, the shelf where they had stood erupted in a spray of molten rock and steam. The mountain's anger had found its voice. "Run!" Dakota grabbed Eleanor's arm, half dragging her as they fled downward through shower of hot ash and stone. Rose wailed against his chest, the sound barely audible above the mountain's roar. Eleanor stumbled, fell, rose again with bleeding knees. Her strength was failing, but terror drove her forward, not for herself, but for the child she had just reclaimed from death's threshold. When her legs finally gave way, Takoda caught her before she hit the ground. Without a word, he hoisted her over his shoulder, her weight seeming insignificant despite his years. With both mother and child secured, he increased his pace, navigating the treacherous terrain with the sure-footedness of one born to these lands. By the time they reached the base of the mountain, Old Widow's Peak had settled into angry muttering once more. Glowing rivulets of lava illuminated the higher slopes, but hadn't flowed far enough to threaten the settlement below. Hollow Creek lay dark and silent in the valley. Takoda paused at the edge of the settlement, his posture tense. "They will try again," he said quietly. Eleanor, now back on her feet but leaning heavily against him, looked toward the cluster of buildings that had been her home. Smoke still rose from chimneys. Lanterns still glowed in windows. Life continued there, but not for her, not for Rose. "Where will we go?" she whispered, the enormity of their situation crushing down upon her. Takoda's expression remained unreadable as he gazed toward the distant canyon where his solitary camp awaited. The infant squirmed against his chest, her tiny fingers clutching at the leather fringe of his clothing. For 15 years he had lived alone with his ghosts, had sworn never to open himself to such loss again. "There is a place," he said finally. "It is not much." "Will they find us there?" Takoda's mouth tightened. "No one finds me unless I wish it." Eleanor looked once more at Hollow Creek, then to her daughter nestled safely against this stranger's chest. A man her people would have called savage, yet who had shown more humanity than those she'd broken bread with for years. "Lead the way," she said softly, turning her back on everything she had known. Dawn broke over the desert landscape in watercolor strokes of amber and rose. Takoda led them through narrow passes and dry washes that no casual traveler would notice, his movements sure, despite the burden of the infant secured against his chest and the weakened woman who followed. Eleanor stumbled frequently, her city-bred feet unused to such terrain. But each time she fell, she rose again without complaint. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Takoda stopped in the shade of a massive rock formation, gently transferring Rose to Eleanor's waiting arms. The baby fussed, her face reddened from heat and hunger. "She needs milk," Eleanor said, the worry evident in her voice. Her own body, weakened from blood loss and exertion, had little to offer. Takoda nodded grimly. From his pouch, he withdrew a small clay container sealed with wax. "Goat's milk. Not much, but it will help until we reach shelter." Eleanor looked at him with surprise. "You keep goat's milk with you?" A shadow passed across his weathered features. "I trade with the Navajo family to the north sometimes. It was for my journey." He didn't elaborate, but his eyes held memories that spoke of purposes interrupted, plans altered by the cries of an abandoned child. They continued through the afternoon, Takoda setting a pace that challenged Eleanor's endurance but respected her determination. As the sun began its descent, they entered a narrow canyon whose walls were painted with ancient handprints and the faded images of deer and thunderbirds. A small stream, precious in this arid land, trickled along its base. "We are here," Takoda announced, leading her around a bend where the canyon widened slightly. Eleanor had imagined a cave, perhaps, or a crude shelter of branches. What she saw instead was a small but carefully constructed dwelling nestled against the canyon wall. Built of stone, wood, and adobe, it blended so perfectly with the surrounding landscape that one could pass within yards and never notice it. Nearby stood a modest corral containing 3 horses and a small pen that housed several goats. "You live alone?" she asked, taking in the evident care and planning that had gone into establishing this hidden homestead. Dakota's only response was a single nod as he held back the deerskin covering that served as a door. Inside, the single room was surprisingly cool and orderly. A central fire pit was ringed with stones, various tools and weapons hung from the walls, and furs were neatly stacked in one corner. Dried herbs and meat hung from the ceiling beams, filling the space with earthy aromas. "Rest," he instructed, pointing to a pallet of soft furs. "I will tend the animals and prepare food." Too exhausted to argue, Eleanor sank onto the indicated bedding, cradling Rose close. Despite her intention to remain alert in this stranger's dwelling, sleep claimed her almost immediately. She awoke to the smell of cooking meat and the gentle gurgle of her daughter. Opening her eyes, she found Rose lying beside her, examining her own fingers with apparent fascination. Nearby, Dakota crouched by the small fire, turning what appeared to be rabbit meat on a wooden spit. A clay bowl of milk sat warming near the flames. Eleanor sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement. "How long did I sleep?" "The sun has set and risen again," Dakota replied without looking up. "The child woke many times. I fed her." Eleanor stared at him, processing both the fact that she had slept nearly a full day and that this taciturn warrior had apparently spent the night caring for her infant daughter. "Thank you," she said softly, the words inadequate for the debt she owed this man. Dakota finally turned to face her, his dark eyes unreadable. "She has spirit, your daughter. Strong lungs." There might have been the faintest suggestion of approval in his tone. He brought the bowl of warmed milk and a small carved wooden spoon for the little one. Eleanor accepted them gratefully, but hesitated before feeding Rose. "My husband, he never returned. He might be looking for us." Dakota's expression hardened slightly. "The people of your settlement left your child to die. Would a father allow this?" The blunt question struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Thomas had been gone for weeks with no word. Had he abandoned them before the rest of Hollow Creek turned against them? "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. Dakota studied her face for a moment, then nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "You may stay until you are strong enough to travel," he said, turning back to the fire. "After that, you must decide your path." Eleanor looked down at Rose, now eagerly accepting the offered milk, her tiny hands batting at the spoon. The angry birthmark seemed less vivid today, more like the blush of sunset than the threat of flame. "And if I have nowhere to go?" she asked quietly. Dakota remained silent, his profile still as the ancient stones that surrounded them. Days melted into weeks with the steady rhythm of desert life. Eleanor's strength returned gradually, her hands growing calloused from new work, her skin darkening under the relentless sun. She learned to milk the goats, to identify which desert plants were edible, to preserve meat in the dry air. Rose grew plumper, her cries more demanding, her dark eyes tracking movement with increasing focus. Dakota remained a mystery, speaking little but observing much. He left at dawn most days to hunt or to check his traps, returning with game or occasionally items traded from distant settlements. Eleanor noticed he never approached Hollow Creek, instead traveling north or east for his infrequent dealings with other humans. One evening, as they sat outside beneath a canopy of stars, so bright they seemed to hang just beyond reach, Rose slept contentedly in a cradle Dakota had fashioned from a hollowed cottonwood log. The night was cool, a blessed relief from the day's heat, and Eleanor found herself studying her silent companion's profile in the firelight. "You're skilled with children," she observed quietly. "Rose settles for you sometimes even better than for me." Dakota continued whittling a small wooden figure, his knife flashing silver in the darkness. For a moment, Eleanor thought he would maintain his usual silence. "I had a son," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. And a daughter. Eleanor's breath caught. It was the most personal information he had offered since their first meeting. "What were their names?" she asked gently. A long pause. "My son was Hania. It means spirit warrior. He was 4 summers when..." His hands stilled momentarily. "My daughter had just been given her name, Tallulah, running water, for she never seemed to stop moving, even as an infant." "They sound wonderful," Eleanor said softly. They were. 2 words, heavy with a grief that had never found proper expression. "And your wife?" "Kimi." For the first time, a hint of warmth colored his voice. She was from another band. Her people were known for their weaving, her hands. He looked down at his own rough palms as if seeing something else entirely. Her hands could create beauty from nothing. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more he needed to say, that perhaps had never been said aloud. "I was hunting when the bluecoats came." His voice had gone flat again, emotionless in a way that spoke of wounds too deep for passion. 3 days, I was gone. 3 days that changed everything. I returned to find our village burning. No one was spared, not the elders, not the children. I found Kimi. He stopped, the knife gripped so tightly his knuckles showed white. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered. Dakota continued as if he hadn't heard. "Tallulah was still in her cradle. She was so small." His voice, always so controlled, fractured slightly. "I buried them together, my wife and daughter. Hania I found later. He had tried to run." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I buried my people, all of them. Then I came here, to this place my grandfather once showed me. I have lived alone since. Until now," Eleanor said softly. Dakota's dark eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their depths. "Until now," he acknowledged. The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Then Rose stirred in her cradle, breaking the silence with a small, discontented noise. Eleanor rose to attend to her, but Dakota was already moving, lifting the infant with a gentleness that belied his warrior's hands. "She is wet," he said, passing the baby to Eleanor. As she tended to Rose, Eleanor noticed the small wooden figure Dakota had been carving. It was a horse, delicately rendered with flowing mane and alert ears. "It's beautiful," she said, nodding toward his handiwork. "For the little one," he replied, "when she is old enough." The simple gesture moved Eleanor unexpectedly. This man, who had every reason to hate those who looked like her, was carving toys for her daughter. "Dakota," she began hesitantly, "the people of Hollow Creek, they don't represent all white settlers. What they did was wrong. What happened to your family was unforgivable, but not all—" "I know this," he interrupted, his voice neither angry nor gentle. "Just as not all Apache are the same. People are people. Some good, some bad, most somewhere between." He looked toward the distant horizon, where the jagged mountains cut a black silhouette against the star-filled sky. "I learned long ago that hatred is a poison that kills the one who carries it first." The wisdom in his words surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. This man had survived losses that would have destroyed most people, yet maintained a core of humanity that allowed him to rescue a woman and child who, by all rights, he might have viewed as enemies. "Will you tell me," he asked suddenly, "about the mark on your daughter's skin?" Eleanor tensed. She hadn't spoken of it since the night on the mountain, had almost managed to forget the reason for their exile. "It's just a birthmark," she said defensively. "No." Dakota's tone was matter of fact. "It is more. I have seen the way it changes sometimes, how it seems to glow when she dreams. This is not ordinary." Eleanor clutched Rose closer. "She's not cursed." "I did not say cursed." Dakota's eyes were serious in the firelight. "Our people believe some children are born with spirits that are more awake, more connected to the forces around us. Such children often bear marks. What are you saying? I am saying, Takoda replied carefully, that your daughter may have gifts that your people fear because they do not understand. But these gifts may one day be needed. Before Eleanor could question him further, a coyote howled in the distance, answered by another closer to their camp. Takoda's posture changed instantly, his body alert, head tilted slightly as he listened beyond the obvious sounds of the night. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, alarmed by his sudden vigilance. "Someone comes," he said grimly. "Many men on horses, still distant but moving with purpose." "How can you possibly know that?" Instead of answering, he stood in one fluid motion. "Take the child inside. Gather only what you need. We may have to leave quickly." "Leave? But this is your home." Takoda's expression was unreadable in the dimming firelight. "Home is not a place," he said quietly. "That is something I had forgotten until recently." The night enveloped them as they moved swiftly through the canyon, Takoda leading one of his horses with Eleanor mounted on its back. Rose strapped securely to her chest with a sling fashioned from a blanket. They had left most of their possessions behind, taking only water, food, weapons, and a few essentials. The other horses had been set free to run, their tracks deliberately leading away from the path Takoda had chosen. "Who do you think it is?" Eleanor whispered, her body tense with fear as they paused in a narrow passage between towering rock walls. "Men from your settlement," Takoda replied, his voice barely audible. 6, maybe 7 riders. They carry torches." Eleanor's blood ran cold. How would they find us after all this time? Takoda's expression was grim in the moonlight. "The mountain spoke the night we fled. Perhaps they believed the child's absence angered it further." He glanced back the way they had come. "Or perhaps your husband returned." The possibility struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Thomas finding their cabin empty, organizing a search, perhaps even blaming Takoda for their disappearance. It made terrible sense. "If it's Thomas, I should speak to him," she said, though uncertainty colored her voice. "Explain what happened." Takoda's eyes met hers, measuring her resolve. "And if he agrees with what they did? If he believes the child is cursed?" Eleanor had no answer. The Thomas she had married 2 years ago would never have abandoned an infant on a mountainside, but drought and desperation changed people. She had seen it transform her neighbors from decent, God-fearing folk into a mob capable of unthinkable cruelty. "I won't risk Rose," she said finally. Takoda nodded once, a gesture of approval, then turned to lead them deeper into the labyrinth of stone that only he knew well enough to navigate in darkness. They traveled until dawn, painted the eastern sky in delicate watercolors. Rose, miraculously, had remained quiet through most of the journey, as if sensing the need for stealth. They made camp in a small depression surrounded by juniper trees, the spot invisible from more than a few yards away. While Eleanor fed and changed Rose, Takoda climbed to higher ground to survey their back trail. When he returned, his expression was marginally less tense. "They reached the canyon at first light," he reported, crouching beside her, "but they seemed confused by the horse tracks. Some argue to follow, others to search the dwelling. They will split up soon." "Will they find this place?" "Not easily," Takoda replied. "Few know these paths, but we cannot stay long." As if to emphasize his words, Rose began to fuss, her face contorting with discomfort. Eleanor tried to soothe her, but the baby's cries grew louder, more distressed. "Shh, little one," Eleanor pleaded, rocking her gently. "Please, we must be quiet." To her horror, the birthmark on Rose's chest began to glow faintly, pulsing with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The child's cries intensified. Takoda moved swiftly to their side, placing a weathered hand on the infant's forehead. "She feels it," he murmured. "The earth's anger." "What do you—" Eleanor began, But her question was cut short as the ground beneath them trembled slightly. Rose wailed louder. "The mountain," Dakota said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's with urgent intensity. "It wakes again, your daughter knows." Another tremor, stronger this time, shook the ground. In the distance, birds took flight from the trees in a sudden panicked cloud. Dakota made a decision. "We must move now. The tremors will hide our sound, and the search party will be distracted." They packed quickly, Eleanor still trying to calm Rose, whose cries had turned to whimpers, but whose birthmark continued to pulse with an unearthly light. As they mounted the horse, a more violent shake nearly threw them to the ground. From somewhere to the south came the sound of falling rock. "Old Widow's Peak!" Eleanor gasped, staring in the direction of the mountain now hidden beyond the canyon walls. "It's erupting again, isn't it?" Dakota nodded grimly. "And your daughter warned us." They rode hard through the morning, the periodic tremors growing more frequent. Rose alternated between fitful sleep and distressed crying, the birthmark flaring brighter with each new quake. By midday, they had left the immediate vicinity of the canyon, emerging onto a high plateau that offered a clear view to the south. Old Widow's Peak belched dark smoke into the azure sky, occasional flashes of orange visible even at this distance. The side of the mountain facing Hollow Creek had partially collapsed, and as they watched, a fresh plume of ash erupted from its crown. "The settlement," Eleanor breathed, her face pale. "They're directly in its path." Dakota's expression remained impassive, but his eyes reflected the distant devastation. Nature does not recognize good or evil, innocent or guilty. It simply is. Eleanor clutched Rose tighter, the baby now eerily quiet, her birthmark slowly fading back to its normal red hue. "Those people tried to sacrifice my daughter to appease the mountain," she said, her voice hollow with the weight of realization. "But Rose, she wasn't the cause of their suffering. She was a warning they refused to understand." Dakota studied the child thoughtfully. "Some are born with the ability to hear what others cannot, to feel what sleeps beneath the earth, to sense the coming storm before the clouds gather." He touched Rose's cheek gently with one finger. "Your people called this a curse because they feared what they did not understand. Mine would have called her a blessing, a bridge between worlds." Eleanor looked down at her daughter, seeing her anew. Not a marked child, not an ill omen, but a gift, a small life with an extraordinary connection to the forces that shape the world around them. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "Where do we go?" Dakota gazed northward, toward distant mountains blue with haze. "There are places where my people still live free, places where the old ways are remembered and honored." He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "A child like Rose would be valued there, protected, taught to understand her gifts." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. He was offering them a future, a place among his people, a home. Eleanor studied his weathered face, this man who had saved them twice now, who had opened his solitary existence to include a white woman and her unusual child, who looked at Rose not with fear, but with respect. Before she could respond, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. A lone rider appeared on the trail below them, pushing his exhausted mount up the steep incline. Even from this distance, Eleanor recognized him immediately. "Thomas," she whispered. Dakota's hand moved to his knife, his body tensing like a cougar preparing to spring. "No," Eleanor said firmly, placing her hand on his arm. "Let me speak to him first." Thomas Wilson crested the ridge, his once proud posture now bent with exhaustion. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt and streaked with ash. When his bloodshot eyes fixed on Eleanor, a complex mixture of emotions crossed his features: relief, confusion, and something darker that made Eleanor instinctively hold Rose closer. "Eleanor!" His voice cracked as he dismounted, stumbling slightly. "Thank God you're alive!" Takoda positioned himself subtly between Eleanor and the approaching man, his stance casual but prepared. Thomas noticed the movement and halted, finally seeming to truly register the Apache's presence. "Step away from my wife, savage," he growled, hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Thomas, don't." Eleanor moved forward, careful to keep Rose partly shielded with her body. "Takoda saved us. Without him, your daughter and I would be dead." Thomas's gaze dropped to the bundle in Eleanor's arms, his expression hardening at the sight of the birthmark visible on Rose's chest, where the blanket had fallen away. "That thing," he said flatly, "is not my daughter." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows. "What are you saying?" "I know what happened," Thomas continued, his voice eerily calm. "Agnes told me everything when I returned. How you bore a marked child, how the drought worsened, the livestock died, how they tried to appease the mountain. They abandoned an innocent baby to die," Eleanor cried. "Our daughter, Thomas." Thomas shook his head, a fevered light in his eyes. "No child of mine would bear the devil's mark. No true child of mine would make the very earth tremble with her cries." He gestured toward the smoking mountain in the distance. "Look what's happened now. Half the settlement buried under ash and rock. The Cunninghams, the Webbs, the Yates family, all gone." Eleanor felt sick. Despite everything those people had done, she hadn't wished death upon them. "The eruption wasn't Rose's fault," she said quietly. "She sensed it coming. That's what her mark means. She feels the Earth's movements before they happen. It's a gift, not a curse." Thomas barked a harsh laugh. "And the savage convinced you of this? That your demon child is special?" His face contorted with disgust. "I came looking for my wife, but I see she's gone, replaced by a woman who lies with Indians and defends abominations." Takoda moved with such speed that neither Eleanor nor Thomas saw it coming. In an instant, he had disarmed Thomas and pinned the smaller man against a boulder, forearm pressed against his throat. "Takoda, no!" Eleanor cried. The Apache warrior's face was a stone mask, but his eyes burned with controlled fury. "This man abandoned his wife when she needed him," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "He would have let his child die on the mountain. He deserves nothing." Thomas struggled uselessly, his face reddening. "Kill me then," he gasped. "Prove what you are." For a long moment, Takoda held him there, the tableau frozen in the harsh sunlight. Then, with evident contempt, he released Thomas and stepped back. "You are not worth killing," he said simply. Thomas slumped against the rock, coughing and clutching his throat. When he looked up, his expression was pure hatred. "The army patrols will hunt you down," he rasped. "They'll kill the savage and take you back where you belong." "And Rose?" Eleanor asked quietly. "What would happen to her?" Thomas's silence was answer enough. Eleanor looked at her husband, this stranger with familiar features, and felt the last threads binding her to her old life snap cleanly away. She thought of Hollow Creek, of neighbors who had become monsters in their fear, of a community that had tried to sacrifice an innocent child to appease their superstitions. Then she thought of Takoda's hidden canyon, of his gentle hands carving a wooden horse, of his quiet strength and the wisdom in his eyes when he looked at Rose, not as a curse but as a blessing. "I know where I belong," she said finally, "and it's not with you, Thomas, not with people who would harm a child because they fear what they don't understand." Thomas's face darkened. "You've made your choice then." "I have." She stepped back to stand beside Takoda, Rose cradled protectively against her chest. Thomas pushed himself upright, swaying slightly. "You'll regret this, Eleanor. When winter comes and you're starving in some filthy Indian camp, when that," he gestured at Rose, "brings more disaster upon you." "The only disaster here," Takoda said quietly, "is a man who cannot recognize the treasures given to him." He picked up Thomas's pistol and emptied the bullets before tossing the weapon at the man's feet. "Take your horse, ride south, do not follow us." Thomas snatched up the gun, his hands trembling with rage or exhaustion or both. He mounted his horse awkwardly, then looked down at Eleanor one last time. "You're dead to me," he said coldly. "You and that demon child." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Goodbye, Thomas." They watched as he rode away, a diminishing figure against the vast landscape, heading back toward the smoldering ruins of Hollow Creek and whatever remained of their former life. When he was out of sight, Eleanor released a shuddering breath. Rose stirred against her, making small noises of discontent, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. "You are certain?" Takoda asked quietly. Eleanor looked up at him, this warrior who had saved them, this man who had lost everything yet still found the capacity to care. "Yes," she said simply, "I am certain." They traveled northward for days, following ancient pathways known only to those who had walked these lands for generations. Takoda led them through hidden valleys and narrow passes, always alert, always watching the horizon for signs of pursuit. Eleanor learned to read the landscape through his eyes, to notice the subtle indications of water, to spot game trails, to distinguish the tracks of deer from those of mountain lions. Rose thrived despite the journey's hardships. The desert air seemed to strengthen her, and her birthmark, though still vivid against her pale skin, no longer pulsed with that eerie light unless the earth trembled, which it did occasionally, aftershocks from old Widow's Peak's violent awakening. "How far to your people?" Eleanor asked one evening as they made camp beside a small, spring-fed pool. The summer stars spangled the indigo sky above them, reflected perfectly in the still water. "2 more days," Takoda replied, carefully building a small fire that would give warmth but little smoke. "There is a band camped near Spirit Canyon for the summer. The leader is Makia, son of my father's cousin. He is a good man." Eleanor nodded, trying to mask her nervousness. "Will they accept us?" Takoda paused in his work, his dark eyes reflecting the first small flames. "There will be questions, suspicion. It is natural." He glanced at Rose, who was sleeping peacefully on a bed of soft rabbit furs. "But the child, they will recognize what she is." "And what is that exactly?" Eleanor asked, the question that had lingered between them finally finding voice. Takoda sat back on his heels, considering his words carefully. "My people believe some children are born with one foot in this world and one in the spirit world. They can sense things others cannot, changes in the earth, approaching storms, illness in the body before it shows itself." He gestured to the birthmark visible on Rose's chest where her blanket had fallen away. "The mark is a sign that the spirits touched her before she entered this world." "In my faith," Eleanor said slowly, "such children were often feared, called witches or demons." "Fear comes from ignorance," Takoda replied simply. "What is not understood is often hated." He added another small branch to the fire. "Among my people, such children were considered blessed, valued. They often became healers or spiritual leaders." Eleanor absorbed this, watching her daughter's peaceful face in the firelight. "Will they accept me? A white woman?" Takoda's expression was unreadable. "It will not be easy. There is much history between our peoples, much blood." He met her eyes directly. "But you are the mother of a blessed child, and you have shown courage and strength. These things are respected." The conversation lapsed into silence, but it was a comfortable one, filled with the night sounds of the desert, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft rustling of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through juniper branches. As dawn broke the following day, disaster nearly found them. They were crossing a dry riverbed when Rose suddenly began to wail, her birthmark flaring with that now familiar glow. Eleanor tried to soothe her, but the infant's distress only increased. "Something comes," Takoda said urgently, scanning their surroundings. "The child feels it." Before Eleanor could respond, a sound like distant thunder reached them. Takoda's expression changed instantly. "Flash flood," he said, grabbing Eleanor's arm. "The mountain rains are sending water down from the highlands. We must reach higher ground immediately." They scrambled up the steep bank of the wash, Eleanor clutching Rose tightly as Takoda helped them climb. They had barely reached the top when a wall of muddy water surged around the bend, carrying uprooted trees and debris in its churning mass. Their horse, still in the riverbed, whinnied in terror. "The horse!" Eleanor cried. Without hesitation, Takoda slid back down the bank, wading into the rising water to grab the animal's reins. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed both would be swept away. Then, with a tremendous effort, Takoda hauled the panicked horse up the slope, all three collapsing safely on higher ground just as the full force of the flood thundered past. Eleanor stared at the raging water that moments ago they had been crossing. "Rose knew," she whispered, looking down at her daughter whose cries had subsided to whimpers. The birthmark was already fading back to its normal hue. "She saved us." Takoda, still breathing hard from the exertion, nodded gravely. "She will learn to understand her gifts with time, to recognize what the warnings mean." "And who will teach her?" Eleanor asked softly. "Who knows enough of such things?" "There is an elder among Makia's band," Takoda said, rising to check the horse for injuries. "Nara. She is very old now, but she was born with similar gifts. She will recognize what Rose is." Eleanor rose, brushing dust from her skirts. Once a proper dress, now cut and resewn into a more practical garment for their journey. "What am I to your people, Takoda? Just the white mother of a special child? A curiosity to be tolerated?" Takoda straightened, his expression softening in a way Eleanor had come to treasure for its rarity. "You are Hozho. What does that mean?" "It is difficult to translate. Beauty, harmony, balance. It is what makes life good and right." His voice lowered slightly. "You brought Hozho back to my life when I believed it was gone forever." The simple confession, delivered without flourish or expectation, moved Eleanor more deeply than any flowery declaration could have. She stepped closer to him, Rose cradled between them. "And you brought it to mine," she replied quietly. For a moment, they stood together on the high bank, the floodwaters rushing harmlessly below them, three souls united by circumstance but remaining together by choice. Spirit Canyon announced itself with walls of red stone that seemed to touch the sky, their surfaces carved by millennia of wind and water into formations resembling faces and creatures watching from another realm. As they approached the Apache encampment, nestled within a protected valley, Eleanor felt her heart pounding against her ribs. Rose, unusually quiet, studied everything with wide, solemn eyes. Takoda raised his hand in greeting as sentries appeared on the ridges above. He called out in Apache, his deep voice echoing against the canyon walls. After a brief exchange, they were permitted to continue forward. The camp revealed itself gradually, dome-shaped wickiups arranged in a loose circle, cooking fires, sending thin ribbons of smoke into the clear blue sky, children playing with small bows or grinding corn under the watchful eyes of their mothers. As they entered the perimeter, all activity ceased. Dozens of eyes turned toward them, curious, wary, some openly hostile. A tall man with gray, streaking his long black hair, stepped forward. His face was deeply lined, his bearing dignified and cautious. "Makia," Takoda said with a respectful nod. The man's eyes moved from Takoda to Eleanor, then lingered on Rose. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone questioning, though not unfriendly. Takoda responded at length, occasionally gesturing toward Eleanor and Rose. Eleanor didn't need to understand the words to recognize that he was explaining their presence, perhaps defending it. Several times, he pointed toward Rose's chest, where the birthmark lay beneath her simple cotton dress. Machia's expression changed subtly. He approached Eleanor slowly, as one might approach a skittish deer, and made a gesture that seemed to request permission to see the child more closely. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before loosening the blanket to reveal Rose's birthmark. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Machia studied it intently, then said something that made several people gasp. "What did he say?" Eleanor whispered to Takoda. "He says she bears the mark of changing woman," Takoda replied quietly. "It is a powerful sign." An elderly woman made her way through the crowd, supported by a gnarled walking stick. Her white hair was braided with feathers and small shells, her face a map of wrinkles that deepened when she smiled. Despite her evident age, her eyes were clear and sharp, missing nothing. "Nara," Takoda said with reverence, inclining his head. The old woman ignored him completely, her attention fixed on Rose. She reached out one weathered hand, and to Eleanor's surprise, Rose immediately grasped her finger, cooing softly. Nara spoke, her voice surprisingly strong. "She says the child has old eyes," Takoda translated. "She says Rose has been sent to help our people in times of great change that are coming." Nara placed her palm gently over Rose's birthmark, then closed her eyes. For several moments, she remained motionless. When she opened her eyes again, they glistened with unshed tears. She spoke directly to Eleanor in halting, accented English. "The mountain gave you this child," she said. "The fire beneath the earth chose her before birth. I have waited many years for her coming." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. You understand what she is?" Nara nodded, pulling aside her own deerskin dress to reveal a birthmark on her chest, smaller than Rose's, but unmistakably similar in its branching pattern. "I will teach her," Nara said simply, "and you will teach us." Machia spoke again, his tone authoritative. Takoda nodded, then turned to Eleanor. "He says you both may stay. You will share my dwelling until one can be built for you." A hint of warmth touched his eyes. "He also says any man who would abandon such a child and woman is a fool who deserves his misfortune." That night, as Rose slept peacefully in a cradle fashioned by the women of the tribe, Eleanor sat beside Takoda outside his wickiup. Above them, stars blazed with a brilliance she had never witnessed in her former life. "They accept her more readily than they accept me," she observed without bitterness. "For now," Takoda acknowledged, "trust takes time to build, but Nara's blessing carries great weight." Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." His fingers tightened around hers. "Long ago," he said quietly, "I believed my path had ended when I lost my family. Now I see it was only changing direction." He looked toward the wickiup where Rose slept, leading me to the moment when I would find a child on the mountain. "And her stubborn mother," Eleanor added with a small smile. "And her very stubborn mother," Takoda agreed, the rare smile transforming his solemn features in the starlight. 5 summers passed in the shadow of Spirit Canyon. Rose grew from an infant into a lively, curious child whose laughter rang like silver bells against the ancient stones. Her birthmark, still vivid against her skin, had become a source of pride rather than shame, a visible reminder of her connection to forces others could only sense dimly, if at all. Eleanor, too, had transformed. Her skin was now bronzed by the desert sun, her once soft hands strong and capable. She had learned the Apache language, their medicines, their ways of moving through the world with respect for all living things. In return, she taught reading and writing to the children, shared knowledge of treating certain illnesses, and introduced techniques for weaving cloth that complemented the tribe's traditional skills. Initially viewed with suspicion, she had gradually earned her place, not as Takoda's woman or even as Rose's mother, but as herself, Eleanor, a bridge between worlds, just as her daughter was. On this particular morning, as dawn painted the canyon walls with liquid gold, Eleanor stood watching Rose sit cross-legged before Nara outside the old woman's dwelling. The child's eyes were closed in concentration as the elder spoke softly, teaching her to listen not with her ears, but with her spirit. "She learns quickly," Takoda said, appearing beside Eleanor so silently she might have been startled once. Now she merely smiled, accustomed to his quiet movements. "Too quickly sometimes," Eleanor replied, a note of maternal concern in her voice. "Nara says her gifts are stronger than any she has seen before." Takoda nodded thoughtfully. The changing times require stronger medicine. It was true, even in this remote canyon, change pressed upon them from all sides. More settlers arrived each season. The army established new outposts. Treaties were made and broken. The old ways faced challenges that had never been encountered before. Rose suddenly stiffened, her small body going rigid. The birthmark on her chest began to glow, visible even through her deerskin dress. Eleanor started forward, but Takoda gently caught her arm. "Wait," he murmured. "Nara is with her." The old woman placed weathered hands on Rose's shoulders, speaking in a low, rhythmic chant. After a moment, Rose relaxed, though the mark continued to pulse with that ethereal light. "What does she see?" Eleanor whispered. "I do not know," Takoda admitted, "but Nara will guide her through it." When the lesson ended, Rose ran to them, her dark eyes, so like Takoda's, bright with excitement. "Mother, father," she called, using the Apache words that had become natural to her tongue. "Grandmother Nara showed me how to feel the earth's dreams." Eleanor knelt to embrace her daughter, marveling as always at how easily Rose accepted the extraordinary gifts she possessed. "And what does the earth dream of, little one?" Rose's expression turned solemn. "Of fire and water, of mountains that sleep and then wake." She touched her birthmark unconsciously, but also of new life that comes after. Takoda crouched beside them, his hand gently stroking Rose's hair, a gesture that had become as natural to him as breathing. Though not her father by blood, he had become her father in every way that mattered, teaching her to ride, to recognize animal tracks, to respect the delicate balance of the desert ecosystem. "You have been given great responsibility," he told her seriously, "to see what others cannot." Rose nodded, her expression momentarily adult beyond her years. Then, like any 5-year-old, she was distracted by a butterfly and dashed off to follow its erratic path. Eleanor stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Sometimes I forget," she said softly, "that she was almost sacrificed for these same gifts." "Fear and wisdom often walk the same path," Takoda replied, "but take different turns at the crossroads." They walked together toward the center of the encampment, where preparations were underway for a feast to mark the summer solstice. Women ground corn and prepared venison, children gathered firewood, and men constructed a large shelter of branches where the celebration would take place. Makia, now a trusted friend, approached them with a respectful nod. "The council has reached a decision," he said without preamble. "When we move to the winter grounds, you will be given the honor of leading the sacred fire procession." Eleanor's breath caught. It was an honor typically reserved for those born to the tribe, a public acknowledgement of complete acceptance. "Both of us?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Makia's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "You, Takoda, and the child who brought you to us, the fire daughter." He gestured to where Rose was now helping a group of children collect stones for the cooking pit. "She belongs to all of us now, as do you." After he left, Eleanor turned to Takoda, emotion making it difficult to speak. "I never expected this," she managed finally. Takoda took her hand, a public gesture that still felt intimate and precious. "Nor did I," he admitted. "When I found you on the mountain that night, I thought only of what honor demanded, not of what might follow." Eleanor leaned against his solid strength, remembering the lonely, grief-hardened man who had rescued them on Old Widow's Peak. The man who had gradually opened his heart again, who had formally taken her as his wife 2 summers ago in a ceremony blessed by both Nara and the tribe's spiritual leader. "Do you ever think about Hollow Creek?" he asked. "About what might have happened if you had stayed?" Eleanor looked out over the canyon, where life thrived despite the harsh conditions. She watched Rose, secure and beloved, using a small stick to show younger children how to write their names in the dirt. "Sometimes," she acknowledged, "but then I remember what they wanted to do to our daughter. How they feared what they didn't understand." She turned to face him fully. "This is where we belong, where Rose can become who she was meant to be." As the sun reached its zenith, Rose suddenly looked up from her play, her expression changing to one of distant concentration. Eleanor recognized it immediately, the look that came over her daughter when her gifts were awakening. Rose stood perfectly still, her small face turned toward the southern horizon. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, she smiled broadly and began running toward them, excitement radiating from her entire being. "Mother! Father! It's coming!" she called. "What is coming, little one?" Takoda asked, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "The rain!" Rose declared, pointing toward the cloudless blue sky. "I can feel it, 3 days' journey away. A big rain that will fill the dry stream beds and make the desert bloom." Nara, who had followed more slowly, nodded in confirmation. "She feels true," the old woman said. "The gift grows stronger." Word spread quickly through the camp. Extra vessels were prepared to catch water. Plans were made to gather the desert plants that would flourish after the rainfall. Celebrations shifted to include prayers of gratitude for the coming blessing. That night, as stars blanketed the sky above their dwelling, Eleanor sat between Takoda and Rose, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate mother fleeing those who would harm her child, to a valued member of a community that celebrated Rose's differences. "The mountain took much from us," Takoda said quietly, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders as they gazed at the stars. "But it gave more in return." Eleanor nodded, watching Rose doze against Takoda's side, her birthmark a faint, comforting glow in the darkness. Once feared as a curse, now recognized as the blessing it had always been. "Not the end of a path," she murmured, echoing Takoda's words from years ago. "Just a change in direction." Above them, a shooting star blazed across the heavens, a brief, brilliant flash of light against the eternal darkness. Eleanor made a silent wish, not for herself, but for the child sleeping peacefully between them, the daughter of fire and stone, whose birth had seemed a calamity, but whose life had become a gift beyond measure. Not just to them, but to all who would know her. For in the end, what determines whether we are blessed or cursed is not the mark we bear, but how we choose to carry it, and those who walk beside us on the journey.